By the time Albin Phillips from New Zealand looked at historical data from Britain and published these findings in 1958, also known as the Phillips curve, Keynesianism was well underway. And one of the things that came along with a lot of governments that implemented Keynesianism was the idea that you could have a trade-off as a result of your fiscal policy decisions between the unemployment rate and inflation. And this is what Phillips found. If you take a look at this visual, Phillips plotted over several years what the rate of change in money wage rates was in Britain. Think of it just as inflation rates, along with the unemployment rate year after year after year. So visualize each of these dots as its own year, and as you can see, after all of the information was put together in one place, he found a general trend. He found that if you drew a trend line in between these dots down the middle, you found this trend of seemingly higher inflation going along with lower unemployment rates, and vice versa. As the unemployment rate swung to higher levels, it seemed as though prices came down. When he published these findings, other people around the world started to look into this relationship and found the same kind of relationship, including Samuelson and Solow. These were Americans looking at American data, and if you take a look at this visual, you'll see that year by year they found a similar kind of trend. There's this light shaded region down in this area that seems to indicate the same relationship. You might want to take this visual and blow it up in your notes so you can see it more clearly. But particularly around the time of the 1960s, they found the same kind of relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. As the inflation rate got higher year by year, the unemployment rate came down, and if the unemployment rate was higher, then at least prices were lower. And so this became almost taken for granted by most economists and politicians, that if there was this relationship, you could, if prices were way too high to be tolerated, bring them down as long as you could live with a little more unemployment. Or conversely, if unemployment was really high, then you could bring that down as well, as long as you could live with a little higher prices. But at least you wouldn't have really high levels of both. And so a lot of people began to believe in this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Here's a simplified version of it using this visual. Inflation rate and unemployment rate, and once again, let's say we happen to be at point A, and we don't like it for whatever reason, or at least the politicians that are implementing fiscal policy don't like it. They feel like the unemployment rate is way too high, then they can bring it down using fiscal policy decisions that we described before, as long as they're okay with having higher prices come along with that decision, and vice versa. Let's look at it one more time in a little different visual. And this is a really hot topic right now as of the summer of 2011, the Greek economy, because the Greek economy has really been on the verge of collapse recently. And so there's all kinds of discussion that has been going on and will continue to go on about what to do about the Greek economy, particularly because they're still members of the Eurozone. But let's say we have the same general kind of visual. We have, for the Greek economy in particular, the inflation rate on one axis, the unemployment rate on the other axis, and this curve, which we'll call the short-run Phillips curve, although at the time that we're talking about, particularly the 50s, late 50s, and on through the 60s, people didn't believe there was just a short-run Phillips curve. They just knew it as the Phillips curve. Later on, we'll talk about how we came to differentiate between the short-run and the long-run Phillips curve. But same relationship. When the unemployment rate is low, inflation is high. When the unemployment rate is high, inflation is low. Now let's stop and think about using an aggregate supply and demand graph, how this would look. So side by side, what we're going to do is draw just a very simplified aggregate demand and supply graph next to the graph of the short-run Phillips curve. And one thing that's easy to do is to confuse one of the axes. But on the left-hand side, as you know already, this is a measure of inflation. We label it price level. And then one of the many things that gets measured down here along this axis even though the official label of the axis is quantity of real GDP, is unemployment. We measure where we are at any one point in time in comparison to our potential, because as we go particularly further and further in this direction, we know that unemployment decreases. But if we move in this direction, unemployment increases. Well, that can be confusing when you compare these graphs side by side, because if you've been trained to expect that to be the case, every time an economy moves to the left, unemployment is getting higher. Every time an economy moves to the right, unemployment is getting lower. You can easily make a mistake when you're looking at a graph that has Phillips curves, because it's the opposite relationship. Remember, we're not measuring the quantity of real GDP that we are in an aggregate supply and demand graph when we come to Phillips curves. We're actually measuring the unemployment rate, and so if we go further in this direction, unemployment is getting higher and higher, not lower. If we go further in this direction, unemployment is getting lower, not higher. So keep in your mind that even though it's good to be visualizing these two kinds of graphs side by side, that the bottom axis is reversed when we're looking at what's happening with unemployment. Now, that being said, let's say we're looking at the Greek economy. And over here on the right-hand side, we put together an aggregate supply and an aggregate demand graph. We're not going to have the legend, we're just going to have a couple of simple basic labels that you would expect. And so let's assume we're in long-run equilibrium, but go back to the short-run Phillips curve, and let's say that we start off here at point A. And then the following year, we move down the curve to a new place, and year 2 is point B. So just as a reminder that these are years, we'll put year 1 next to point A. Oops. And we'll put year 2 next to point B. Where could you find that over in the Greek economy graph that has aggregate supply and demand? Well, we don't know exactly where we are in terms of long-run equilibrium necessarily based on looking at the short-run Phillips curve yet, but let's just say we're going to start here. We'll pick that as our arbitrary starting point, and that'll be year 1. How do we get to a point for year 2 that makes sense and corresponds with the graph on the left? Well, what's happening with the graph on the left? We're starting with high inflation, and what's happening to inflation? It's decreasing as we slide down this curve to point B. So on the aggregate supply and demand graph, we need prices to come down. We also need, for that to be a true match, we need unemployment to get higher. So price level needs to decrease, unemployment needs to increase. You only have 4 options over here on the aggregate supply and demand graph. You could have aggregate demand shift right, or aggregate demand shift left. You could have short run aggregate supply shift right, or short run aggregate supply move left. Which of those 4 options is going to give you what you want? Which of those 4 options is going to have prices come down and unemployment increase? So we need this to happen, right? We need to have the equilibrium point, PL sub 1 and Q sub 1 change in that fashion. So we need to move further down that way, and we need to have unemployment increase, which means that we have to have Q sub 2 somewhere over there, right? We're going from left to right on the Phillips curve graph, but we have to go from right to left on the AD and Saras graph. So there's only one of these four options that can do that. What's going to bring prices down, but also increase unemployment? Correct. I sound like Dora, right? Where she asks you a question and assume you're going to get the answer correct after pausing. Well, my students are so brilliant, I know they're all going to get the answer correct. And so AD has to shift to the left. This is your answer to get us from point A to point B and have the graphs match. This is one of four scenarios, of course. If I had said, so let's say that we're starting at point B and then year 2 we go to point A, what would happen on the aggregate supply and demand graph that would have to match up with that and show how that happened? It would be AD moving to the right. Now we're going to talk about what it looks like for Saras to move right and left in just a second. But suffice it to say for now that most economists leading up to about 1970 and most politicians that were using Keynesianism as a philosophy for fiscal policy were assuming that this was the only thing that we could expect. That we would, generally speaking, it's not a perfect straight line curve that they're banking on, but generally we would expect this relationship between inflation and unemployment. And that we could make decisions year to year about how to have these trade-offs. And that was almost assumed just to be how the world was until the 1970s. Mr. Gideon was born in 1970. Maybe it was a sign of bad things to come. But that's when the relationship started to go in a direction people did not expect. What happened? Well, in the United States, surging oil prices due to the embargo and wars and revolutions in the Middle East, as well as a slowdown in labor productivity growth, led to something that we later came to define as stagflation. Stagflation is a term that combines the other terms stagnation and inflation. It's when Saras shifts left, causing rising prices and rising unemployment. And as you might be able to visualize, if we're using the Greek economy side by side and that happens, then we're going to have a different kind of visual develop. So let's go ahead and show that. Let's say that we have the Greek economy on the left with Phillips curves. Well, for now only one. A short run Phillips curve. And that's all that people knew at the time. They didn't think in terms of short run Phillips curve. I'm just planting that seed now. At the time, before the 70s hit, it was just the plain old Phillips curve. Down here we have unemployment. And for the Greek economy, using an aggregate supply and demand graph, we can go back to where we started. We have the quantity of real GDP down here, and we have the price level. But once again, these two axes match up. If we go further to the top, that means inflation is rising. Those things match up. But as we move further and further down to the bottom, that means prices are declining. But down here on this axis, things are flipped around. So let's say that it's Greece, or it's United States, or it's Great Britain, regardless, and 1970 hits. And things start to change, and we have Saras shifting left. We just throw some labels down over here, and we start again at point A, but Saras shifts to the left. This will be our point B. What does that mean in terms of prices and unemployment? Well, here are our new equilibrium points. If Saras shifts left, then unemployment increases. Unemployment increases when we go from Q1 to Q2. And over here, where we have PL sub 1 and PL sub 2, what happens? Prices rise. We didn't realize this so much until the dust had cleared and we had looked at the situation. When I say we, I mean economists, of course. And this is what was not supposed to happen. We were not supposed to have rising prices and rising unemployment, both of the bad things increasing at the same time. What that does is it breaks the mold, of course, over here with the Phillips curve. We're no longer sliding from one point to another. We're in a completely different spot. So let's say we started here as point A. Well, now point B isn't somewhere else along that curve. Point B is somewhere over here, where, if you compare the two spots, unemployment is rising as well as prices. So that got people thinking. And it was a really difficult, painful time. This is one of the few times that I can say in my life that I have some recollection of because I lived through it. In the mid-70s, my parents, because of times being tight, had to sell our home, and for a short period of time we had to move in with my grandparents. They had a small guest house in the back, and it was my parents, and it was me and my brother, and later, not too long after that, came my younger sister. That was not a lot of space for that size of family, but we had no choice. The unemployment rate was high. We had to save money somehow. And I also clearly remember a couple of blocks from my grandparents' house having assigned days, like so many Americans did, to go and get gas because there was this shortage, this embargo that had been implemented by the oil-producing nations, particularly in the Middle East. And so we had to ration out how much gasoline each citizen could have. And I can't recall exactly how it played out at that time when I was a kid, but I want to say 2 days a week you had assigned dates in California where you could go to a gas station based on your license plate number. And if you didn't have the right license plate number for that day, they'd say, get out of here. It's not your day to get gasoline. And as you might be able to guess, when you did have your day, it was a really long line. Some people had to sit in their cars, and I was, a part of one of those families that had to do this periodically. We'd have to sit in our car for 2 hours waiting to get gasoline. And some people didn't just fill up their tanks when they got to the front of the line. They had other containers they would use to fill up gas, and that's how times were. So I'm kind of dating myself, and I know I'm old, but this is a great experience, I think, to be able to share with you because I was just old enough to remember it. And of course, people started to re-examine what we thought we knew about the supposed trade-off between inflation and unemployment. The reality is that what we found in the 70s, and this isn't the only time it happened, was that we were experiencing a shift in Sarras and in the Phillips curve theory, in that model, also a shift of the short-run Phillips curve. So a movement like from SRPC sub-0 to SRPC sub-1 as a result of what some people call negative supply shock. And that's what we were living through in the 70s. Now, it's also possible that the short-run Phillips curve can shift to the left, like it does here from SRPC sub-0 to SRPC sub-2. Something like that happened in the 1990s when the prices of oil and other resources fell and productivity growth accelerated. But if you go back in the notes here, and I'll go with you, to this diagram, right, you'll see more of what I'm talking about. In this shaded area, we certainly have some years clumped in two different time periods that show this relationship of, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. But take a look at the year I was born, 1970, right in here. Just before, in 69, all right, that's a year that looks like it fits in the distribution and fits into the theoretical model, and all of a sudden, boom, it jumps out. Inflation rate gets higher somewhat, unemployment definitely increases, and the numbers start to go in a completely different direction until you kind of seem to settle into another short-run Phillips curve before there's another shift. Just for a couple of years in the early 70s, and then boom, 1974. Prices skyrocket, unemployment is still greater, it settles there very briefly, and then we have a shift back. So you could argue perhaps a short-run Phillips curve now shifting to the left and resettling for a couple of years. So there's data here that indicates that there is a trade-off in the short run. For a few years, we can settle into a groove, a short-run Phillips curve, but then we're going to move in a different direction over the long term, and you can use the data to say, yeah, I can kind of visualize how we have more than one short-run Phillips curve included in that time frame. So what's happening? Well, before we talk about that, here's a good summary graph that I think will help you kind of keep in mind the different shifts in aggregate supply and demand, and how those connect to certain points that you would have on the short run and long run Phillips curve. But what happened was the classical theorists argued we could have a trade-off in the short run but not in the long run. That there is something called the long run Phillips curve, pictured here, and that this acts like a magnet. That an economy over the long run is going to be drawn to the natural level of unemployment. And because of this, fiscal policy that's designed to move aggregate demand can possibly create some relief or some change in the short run, but over the long run, because, as classical theorists say, flexible wages and prices prevail, the economy is going to adjust, and it's going to come back to its long run equilibrium. So you can think of the long run Phillips curve as a symbol of one of those things that you find under long-run aggregate supply. As you know, at the bottom of long-run aggregate supply, we find the natural level of unemployment, and that's exactly what the long-run Phillips curve symbolizes. And for classical theorists, this makes perfect sense. As we've talked about before, if wages and prices are flexible, whenever we're in a gap, Sarras will make the move to adjust the economy. And that's exactly what's happening when you have the early 1970s happen, and up until then we could count on some trade-offs in the short run, but eventually the economy fixes itself. It gets back to this theoretical place where there's the natural level of unemployment, and that unpredictability for Keynesians anyway, and for politicians that believe in Keynesianism, takes place. But before we talk more about this, just understand and remember that if we're going to have a movement along the short-run Phillips curve, that's due to changes in aggregate demand. If you actually put pen to paper or stylus to computer and you draw these changes enough, it'll sink in. But if we're going to move off of a short-run Phillips curve and go to a new point that's not on an existing short-run Phillips curve, and let's say maybe that reestablishes a new area of trade-off, so now we have to draw a new short-run Phillips curve. That happens as a result of changes in SRAS, including stagflation. Right? So stagflation is only going to occur as a result of a shift in Sarras. Movement along the curve, the short-run Phillips curve from one point to another, is only due to changes in aggregate demand.